Hi, my name is Dr. Tom Barnett. I'm the Academic Dean of the Institute for Christian Education. I'll also be your professor today. This is EDU 260, Early Childhood and Development Psychology. And we're going to be going over Part 1. You'll be taking a test over this Part 1 and Part 2 and Part 3 and Part 4. Your test will be true and false. That's the format. And the tests come exactly from this video and from the text in which you're going to be tested on. So your idea is to read carefully and then apply the knowledge to the true or false statements. So let's begin. Early childhood and development theories. First question is, what is a developmental milestone? What's a milestone? Well, in your life and my life, we think of milestones as being things that we achieve. A first dance, a first date, a first time to drive, graduating from high school. Well, in early childhood, there are milestones that seem much smaller, but they're equally significant. There's a physical milestone. That's one of the first ones that's conquered by kids. From birth to 3, you're learning to talk, to listen, to learn, to walk, to taste, to eat, to go to the potty. You're learning to do all these major milestones that you'll utilize for the rest of your life. So from birth to 5 years old, some of the most important and significant things that are developmentally necessary for a human being to be a productive and successful, both mentally and physically, occur. And so the other thing is a cognitive milestone. Cognitive meaning to think, or your mind. So you're learning to recognize people, mom, dad, brother, sister. You're learning to recognize that fire is hot, ice is cold. You have crunchy cookies and smooth cookies and vanilla ice cream and chocolate ice cream. You're learning to feel textures. You're learning to be afraid. You're learning to understand and recognize. You're learning to verbalize your own feelings when you're hungry, when you have to go to the potty, when you are sad, when a dog bit your finger. So cognitive development is a lot more than just thinking. It is output and it is input. And we all learn at different rates. We all learn in different schemes. We all learn in different times. The physical development and cognitive development frequently go hand in hand. So if a child is just laying on their back and crying and they can't walk, they have no fear of falling. But if a child begins to walk and they learn if you fall, it hurts, now that thought process out of necessity has kicked in. Now, social and emotional milestones. These are involved in interaction, learning to blow bubbles on a baby's stomach and letting them laugh, tickling them, singing to them, playing with them. They learn to swing and they learn to be held. They learn to be picked up and comforted. Okay, those are emotional milestones. We are not born with concepts such as love, hate, anger, prejudice. These are all learned things. Now, we are emotionally and genetically pre-programmed for these things. We're emotional learning machines, just as we are physical walking machines and we are physical thinking machines. We don't have to think about smell. What we have to think about is whether we like what we smell or not, like what we taste or not. And taste and smell and hearing, those things develop as we grow. And then, so you have the social interaction between brothers, sisters, mothers, children, classmates. So between birth and 5, you learn to socially develop. You learn to interact with people appropriately and inappropriately. Just as in all things, just as you have food that is good tasting and bad tasting, thus you have inappropriate and appropriate. Communication milestones, both language, nonverbal and verbal. 1-year-olds are learning how to say their first year words, and by 5-year-olds you have a communicating basic root vocabulary. So during that course of time, several things happen. First, you learn to communicate. You develop your accent. If you're from Ireland, you sound like you should kiss the Blarney Stone. If you're from England, or if you're from Australia, or if you're an Aborigine, or you're from South Africa, or you're from Wales, or you're from Mexico, or you're from southern United States. You develop not just your verbal cues, but you develop your accent. You develop language skills. You develop dynamic language skills. Several things can interrupt those things, such as sickness, tonsillitis, ear aches. Those type of things have a lot to do with learning to verbalize, and if you are delayed language-wise, generally you'll be delayed reading-wise too. And we'll discuss that under learning theories in a little while, but for the moment we're going to talk exclusively about milestones. So learning to collect words, learning to collect the meaning of the words, and learning to use them. So let's now trace this all the way back. So you have a physical milestone, so you learn to walk. You have a cognitive milestone, you see the dog and you want to go walk to the dog. You have a social emotional milestone, now you want to interact with the dog. You have a communication milestone, you squeal and yell doggy and walk towards the doggy, and now the doggy runs away from you, or the doggy bites you, or the doggy growls at you. So now you have a thought process in this cognitive skill, thinking, wow, I don't want to pet that dog because that dog is mean. So while all of these milestones are individually important, they are also interconnected in the developmental issue of an early childhood developmental process. So as you learn the small and large motor skills, as you learn the small and large cognitive skills, can they be shaped and directed? The answer is absolutely. Such as language can be absolutely shaped and directed. Now, we're going to discuss Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud has gotten a really, really bad rap. I'm not a big fan of Sigmund Freud, but I want you to think of Sigmund Freud more like a Model T or a Model A. I would not go out and buy a Model T for my daily transportation needs today in 2012 because it's inefficient. It doesn't work. It doesn't meet the fuel emission standards. It doesn't get good gas mileage. It doesn't do those things. The tires, it rides on springs. It's a rough ride. It has all sorts of things. You know, lanterns hang in the front of it for lights, you know, originally, that kind of thing. So today I would much prefer to drive something that is 2012 relevant. Sigmund Freud was the first one to come up with the concept that there's something more to us than our mind and our body and our spiritual nature. He said there's a mind, and within that mind we develop. He was the first one under his stage theory, regardless if you agree with the stage theory or not agree with the stage theory, who said we begin learning from the time we're born, and we continue to learn. And he also recognized the fact that the formative years, the early years of our life, were highly significant. When we were learning to walk, go to the bathroom, when we were learning to be involved socially, learning to think, and he recognized these. He also recognized if we have disruption in those years, if we have a thing that goes on that creates harm, if it creates something too good or too horrible or something that creates problems within those, he recognized that. You know, he basically was a medical doctor and a researcher, and he's looking at this thing from a standpoint of, I wonder why. I wonder why a child learns to talk. Why does a child hear? Why can we hear a voice over a lawnmower and a car driving by, but yet you can still recognize a voice? So for all the bad rap that Sigmund Freud has gotten through his psychosocial development and his psychosexual development and all of his different things, he actually does come up with some very simple ideas. One of my very favorite professors used to say, Sigmund Freud said two really good things. One, if you don't pay, you don't get better. And number two, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. He had all these symbols and images and things, and he's an interesting historical study. The type of counseling he practiced works because it's long-term, it's talk therapy, it's looking at your childhood, it's looking at your life, it's coming up with your own conclusions about your life. So it's not too far off of what we do today, except it had a very interesting model that it took on, and his interpretations were very interesting too, especially when you get into the id and the ego and the superego. Well, he takes it from birth to 1 year old, from 1 to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 11, 11 to 18. The oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latent stage, and the genital stage. So he has these stages of life. That was his idea, that we grow up in stages and phases. Genetics wasn't postulated yet. He wasn't. We didn't even understand the full scope of the brain and the neural paths and all the intricacies of things. There wasn't a DMSR, to say, hey, there's different types of mental illness. He took none of that into account. What he took into account is we learn as we grow. So that basically is Sigmund Freud. The next individual we're going to look at through learning development and stage theory of children and all the way through adulthood is Erik Erikson. Erikson proposed a stage development theory which encompassed human growth through the entire lifespan of humans, saying that we are plastic, we're malleable, we change, we develop, we adapt. We also have stages and phases that we go through. So the first stage is the infant stage. The infant stage obviously being, and that is called the basic stage, and there's where we develop the concept of trust versus mistrust. So what he's saying is at each stage along our path, along our journey in life, we can get broken. Something can happen. Detachment disorder is a disorder that looks at, and we're going to go into this much later with learning theory and with assessment. Detachment disorder is saying that if a child is not held enough, loved enough, cared enough, or abandoned by its primary caregivers, or doesn't have a primary caregiver, it can develop a whole lifetime of mistrust. There's some pretty good evidence for this. So Erikson, although his concept springboarded off of Freud, saying, okay, there's stages, he took it the next step and he said, we have a number of stages we go through. And what Freud would argue is that the formidable stages happen early on. Later on, the stages are not as impactful. I'm not sure about that. I don't know that that's an absolute truth, that he has a legitimate argument. So let's take a look at this. Toddler, autonomy versus shame. If you have a toddler and every time they try to do something, try to walk, you pick them up, then they never learn to walk. So autonomy meaning that they now are beginning to act independently, and if they fail in some form or fashion, then the theory is, from Erikson anyway, that there's shame. Then preschooler, you're intuitive versus guilt, where you're learning purpose in life. You're learning that you need to ask for a cookie and not steal a cookie. School-age children, and this is competence. This is industry versus inferiority. So everybody who's ever played kickball or soccer or something, whatever, or tag, all little kids line up and you have two team captains, and nobody wants to get picked last because that's viewed as the inferior person. The short guy in the basketball team, I know all about that one. The fat kid who doesn't get picked for the relay race, so forth and so on. We also know about industry, where we write a paper, we take a spelling test in school, and we get an A, or we get our picture put up on the board because it was the prettiest one that was colored. So we understand industry versus inferiority. And what Erikson today would probably say, that's attached to our self-esteem. That's attached to how we feel about ourselves, and it develops early on in school age. Then he has adolescence, and that's identity versus identity diffusion. Now, identity diffusion would be an adolescent going through puberty and junior high and high school are searching for what social group they would develop, what social group they would develop in, who they would identify with. Are they a football player, a band person, an artist? Are they a ballerina? Are they a drill team? Are they a wallflower? Are they a nerd? Are they a computer analyst? What are they? What group socially do they fit in? And that seems to have an emerging thing. Well, the lack of identification in that area seems to lead to a person who has a lack of purpose. And so extracurricular activities, although they cost a lot of money in schools, I realize that, are very beneficial to children. They help them develop in a lot of different ways that education in a book won't. I don't know about you, but when I was young, I liked to go play with my friends more than I liked to read and do math. I don't know. Young adolescence, young adult, intimacy versus isolation. Well, in Erickson's world, that's when you got married, that's when you started dating. Well, today, in 2012, things have blurred the lines. Kids start dating in elementary, which is wrong, and junior high, which is wrong, and high school, which should barely happen, okay? But in looking at the lines being blurred, and so imagine if you haven't developed a full adolescent scheme of identification in industry, but yet now you started dating. So does your whole world become your industry, the love or the puppy love for the boy or the girl? And now they become your whole world and your whole identity, because now you're trying to play married when you're 15. And you're trying to play house when you're 15, when what you should really be doing is worrying about what t-shirt to wear to school. So in Erickson's view, you're looking at these blurring lines, and as they begin to blur, problems begin. When stage development doesn't occur naturally, you have some problems. Then you have middle age, and he's saying, productivity or generativity versus self-absorption. Well, in middle age is where you really see the emergence of the abnormal, of the self-absorption. You begin to see between the age of 25 and 40. This is where we've identified most of the drug addicts, most of the alcoholics, most of the bioholics, most of the divorces occur during this time, most of the self-absorption, the self-fixation over what makes me happy, productivity versus self-destruction in a lot of ways. And so there's a pretty good argument that, depending on where you want to mark middle age, I move middle age all the way up to about 25 and move it to about 40. There's people who would say, well, that's 30 to 50. Well, maybe it is. But you're an adult a lot longer than you're a child. By the time you're 21, 22, mathematically, you've left your childhood. I think it actually happens about 25. Between 23 and 25, there seems to be another phase in there where we begin to leave our real childhood and begin to act like adults. And one of the evidences we have for this is look at a freshman who starts college. 99% of them flunk out the first time. They start back over and they try again. And the next time they do a little better, but by the time they're 23, 24, 25, they've learned to be successful. They've learned to work. They've learned to wash their own clothes and take care of their own self. Well, this industry package that they have created now sets them up for a successful adulthood or a non-successful adulthood, which we would call middle age. Then we have Erickson saying that older adults, and in his term, wisdom would be the word he identifies with it, integrity versus despair. Now, integrity versus despair, it may be an old school way of saying this is who you are as an older person. I found it to be somewhat true. There is no substitute for experience, and we accumulate experiences, both good and bad. We accumulate bad things that happen to us, and we accumulate good things that happen to us. And our experiences tend to give us an idyllic identification for the future. And as we enter into an older phase, which I'm in an older phase of my life now, I'm beginning to look at what does the future hold? And I can list the things I don't want to do, and I can list the things I haven't done, and I can list the things that are priority that I want to do. And either they are industrious or they are non-industrious. Either they are full of despair or they're full of integrity. In other words, I've never been to Israel. I want to go to Israel. Okay, I want to write another book. See, these things have all industry pointed. Now, if my whole desire was, well, I want to go down to the local bar and get drunk again this Friday night. And that's the same thing I've been doing since I was 25. That has an element of despair. Okay, if one of your goals is to get out of debt and live comfortably in retirement, that's industry, and that's wisdom, and that's experience teaching you that debt is no fun. So Erickson had this very simplistic 8 stages, and it was interacted with social, emotional, cognitive, experiential. It was dynamic in its approach. So he was truly one of the pioneers of a developmental type theory that said, we are not static. We don't get to 5 years old and we've learned everything we've ever learned and we're just going to apply these basic skills. You know, if we had bad potty training, we're going to be greedy the rest of our life. Now, certainly as a Christian, we look at a 3-legged stool, a mind, body, and spirit. And as a Christian university, as a Christian college, and as a Christian ideology, I also know there's a spiritual maturity that comes by experience too. It comes by knowledge, and it comes by the acceptance of Christ, and then you begin to birth from that.